Okay, hello everyone. I think we're ready to make a start now. So, a very warm welcome to all of you to the latest in our series on diversifying our map collections by the Map Curators Group of the British Cartographic Society. And it's great to see names still joining us from far and near today. And if it's your first time joining one of these sessions, then a particular welcome to you. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here today. Just a couple of points of order before we start. We will be recording today's talk, but we will stop the recording when we reach the Q&A section afterwards. So if, as we go along, you think of questions, please do feel free to pop those in the Q&A. We have enabled the Q&A function, so do feel free to submit those questions there. And time permitting, we'll try and get through as many of those as we can afterwards. Those of you who are MCG regulars will know that the focus of many of our past sessions has been related to collections interpretation, particularly thinking about the way we describe and present and frame our maps in a way which is appropriate to the often very complex stories behind them. All of those discussions so far have taken place specifically in the context of map collections. But we felt that as people working with maps, as well as learning from each other, there's also a lot that we can learn from other types of collections too, and some of the excellent work that's been happening more broadly across the libraries and museum sector. And so it's in that context that we're really delighted to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Marenka Thompson-Odlum. Marenka is Research Curator for Critical Perspectives at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. Many of you, I'm sure, will have some familiarity with the Pitt Rivers Museum, which houses the anthropological collections of the University of Oxford, just up the road from us here at the Bodleian Library. And Marenka, I'm sure, will introduce her work to us in more detail shortly. But we would like to thank you, Marenka, for taking the time to speak to us today. And we're all really looking forward to hearing from you just now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you everyone for having me this afternoon or whatever time it is where you are in the world. Um, I will begin by sharing my screen if I remember how to do it. It's been quite a while. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'll take that as a yes. Um, so as Martin said, I work for the Pitt Rivers Museum, the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of Oxford. This is my sixth or almost seventh year actually at the museum. And when I began working here on a one-year project called Labeling Matters. Um, and just a very brief overview for Labeling Matters. As I said, it started in 2019, and it was to do a survey of the problematic language and interpretations used in the Pitt Rivers Museum. And I'm just going to show you, in case you don't know what the Pitt Rivers Museum looks like, this is a picture of it. It houses about 650,000 objects, photographs, manuscripts, and archives. And yeah, it has a very unique view and aesthetic, I would like to say. Um, and yeah, and a lot of the interpretation and labeling are, some of them are actually original from the 1884 when the museum was first opened, and have then kind of have, and there's a lot of work that's been done in those almost 140 years, but there's still a lot of holdovers from the Pitt River, from that early time, but also just come from a lot of colonial histories. And so I just like want to like briefly remind everybody that, sometimes we have visitors come into the museum and ask, why are you just kind of focusing on kind of colonial histories in the museum? And I actually show this map that I kind of created as part of the project, just to kind of remind people where a lot of our collections come from. As you can see, the lighter areas on the map are part of the former British Empire, and the larger the dots, more collections we have there. And if you look closely, you can see some of the larger dots, the larger parts of our collections map on very well to parts that were part of the British Empire or British Protectorate or whatever terminology um, was used. And so that is kind of why so that's kind of the impetus for this whole project was. As I said, I'm here 7 years on, so the project's still ongoing, although my role has like greatly expanded. And I just wanted to tell everybody that this is kind of today, my talk's not really going to focus on kind of giving you all the answers. I don't think that's possible, and no one has the answers, but it's going to more follow on the methodology that I used to kind of unpack how we kind of interpret things and how ideas, even though the words change, often they hold some of the same past and problematic rhetoric. But if you are looking for kind of information on just like terminology that's not to use, there are really good resources like the Words Matter publication that was done out of the Netherlands, and Tobias, which is a Europeana project as well, and they're really good and they have really good resources as something that you might want to follow up on. But yeah, to go back to just the labeling matters really briefly, as I said, overview problematic language of the museum. In 2020, there was a bit of a push to actually put some of that kind of work or research into the museum. And that was because, as you can see here, of course, George Floyd's murder. And so there would be Black Lives Matter protests as well as Rhodes Must Fall protests happening at the same time during lockdown in Oxford. And a lot of those kind of were held or ended up on the lawn in front of the museum. And so before we reopened for lockdown, there was kind of a push to have some form of acknowledgement in the museum. And so that led to some interventions that I will show you briefly. All right. And before I continue, I will say that there will be some labels that have derogatory language. Often I actually don't say the words, but I just want to kind of also give you that content warning before going on. So when I started the project, there was some really kind of key things. One, there's wording that was very kind of overtly problematic, as you can see on some of the labels in front of you. Um, and then the ones that that I like to say were more euphemistic. So for example, the two lower ones that saw is Mongol Buddhist priest outer robe, and the next one that says crimson velvet blue silk line coat trimmed. These often are actually written by the same curator in the 1940s. And what is really interesting is that same curator, both for textile, as part of the textile collection, writing this, but one uses the word looted during 1891, and the other one just says the word found. Um, and the difference in these two is that for the Buddhist priest robe, that was, as it says here, quote unquote, looted during a conflict, kind of internal conflict in East Asia, while the one from Rangoon, 1824, was from the Battle of Rangoon, it was during the First Anglo-Burmese War. So basically, um, between a European power and a non-European power. And so it's really interesting that one chooses the word looted, and then the other one says found. And so kind of when I was going through a lot of the language, there's all these euphemisms, trying to kind of unpack that, but also trying to unpack language used to describe people from all different culture groups that I had, did not have knowledge of because the collections are global. Talking more about euphemistic language for the Benin bronze case, or the Court of Benin case at the Pitt Rivers Museum. This slide I can actually say is out of date because we just redid the case with co-curatorial methods, so the labeling is better. But as of just of last year, the case label read a small British party of British officials and traders on its way to Benin was ambushed. In retaliation, the British military forced and attacked the city. The Oba was exiled. The expedition brought thousands of objects back to Britain. As you could say, a lot of that's technically not wrong, but also does not kind of tell you the whole story. And kind of quantifies as small, but when for the the first party of officials, but then do the big tack, the punitive expedition, as it's called, of 1897. It's not quantified, that no numbers are written. Terms like ambush and retaliation are used. And so again, very like euphemistic is what it's saying, and biased. So yeah, but as I said, this is actually not longer the current case label. As of last year, it's the old case label, so that's great. Um, and so yes, I kept on kind of butting up against all these things about, yes, there's kind of outright offensive or derogatory language. For example, you still see the word savage written on some of the labels. But then my question, but there were other forms of language that I was just like, we need to actually break down the idea of, before I can think of a solution, I need to kind of lay out how we create and how we think about labeling and interpretation, and language. And so for that, um, I basically kind of borrowed from a theoretical like framework from Anibal Quijano, who's a South American um, theorist, a sociologist, and anthropologist. And that idea is he frames as a colonial matrix of power. And the idea that coloniality, so when I say coloniality, what I mean is those systems that kind of uphold like call colonial ideas. So not the occupation of a space, but kind of even when that place is deoccupied, or that all those systems that are in place that still kind of create a specific kind of hierarchy. And so he kind of has three broad systems in which he usually works in. There's hierarchies, knowledge, and culture. And taking that, I kind of took that idea and literally mapped it onto every single case and every single piece of text in the museum. Also, sometimes I use it on the database as well, but I also sometimes use it when I'm just like writing an email and wanting to make sure, depending on what it is. So I use it in literally all contexts of my life, to kind of make sure I'm not accidentally kind of holding up certain kind of rhetorics and ideas. So things I ask myself, does this label, display, or whatever text, or catalog entry, does it establish hierarchies? So when I say hierarchies, I mean false hierarchies. So often we have, ideas around gender, race or ethnicity, labor, and all those kind of creation of that kind of colonialism and imperial ideas of like false hierarchies. Often all those things intersect. So they're not always easy to kind of unmesh, but I always ask myself that. And so you should ask, like, how does that maybe in your line of work, right? As well as map and cartography curators, how does that apply to you? I also then ask myself, does this label, display, piece of text assign power to and privilege the production of only Eurocentric knowledge? So yeah, this is not the idea that like one is better than the other, but is one being privileged over everything else? And so, kind of thinking about that and how do you mitigate that within your setting? Um, and then, and so, yeah, I think that can go for a lot of things. When we think about what is Eurocentric knowledge? So, you can often be say, but oh, this is objective because it's rational or scientific. But then kind of thinking about actually that is privileging one kind of knowledge over the other. So how do you kind of make that more equitable across the board? And then lastly, I say lastly, but actually there's four, but for now we do three. This is impose white Eurocentric culture. So idea, does it impose specific ideas of religion or gender, or even economic systems? Does that impose it on something that in the museum, for example, because we have such global collections, often you find that the labels impose a very specific, like maybe British view of something onto something that is non-British. So that is an example. And there's a last one, which I didn't put here, but because actually Quijano doesn't talk about it that much, but I created it as, so it's toponyms, so place names, which is actually perfect for you guys. And, what I found a lot in museum as I walked around was that a lot of the old labels still had the old place names. And not only old place names, I would say, but also names that are not the local terms used by people for that place. And what I had a really interesting time doing was kind of doing a deep dive into what does changing that name kind of in a label due to not the object, but also how people interact with the objects. And it was really fascinating. For example, we have one case called lamellophones. And yeah, I before I started working in the museum, I didn't want to know what a lamellophone was. But basically, it's mbiras, or we call them thumb pianos. Used a lot in different parts of the world, but also like very important in Southern Africa, especially Zimbabwe. And so when we use the term in like so many, we have quite a few Southern African visitors come through the museum. But when you see the term lamellophones, everyone just walks past it unless you happen to look down at the case. But then when we tried to use the term imburas instead, it was really interesting how much more engagement there was. And so, you know, that was that's about naming. And within that case, what was even more interesting was that a lot of the on written on a lot of the objects, because a lot of the older objects when they came in, they were actually written, the labels were written on them, had the old place name for Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. And it was just really interesting to then talk to people about how like that led to a whole conversation, right? About, obviously Rhodesia for Cecil Rhodes being the colonial place name, but how that name stripped so much away from like Zimbabwe. And then I would always get the history of why Zimbabwe is called Zimbabwe today. And so, how those things were linked and how during the colonial period, the Imbira was um, it wasn't, it was almost seen as something that they didn't want the people to use because it was a way of communicating, but it was also a way of upholding local stories and traditions. So they tried to strip that away. And so it was just really fascinating that from changing a name of the case, but also like looking and talking to people about the place names, there was just this whole connection between and kind of like how it empowered people when we kind of righted that when we actually used the correct terminology. So yeah, it was really so yeah, colonial toponyms. So just toponyms, that's the fourth one. Um so yeah, so just to kind of go into a little bit more um, detail very quickly, just to kind of give you an idea of how we did this within the museum for interventions. As I said, these interventions were supposed to be temporary. They went up during COVID, so they were vinyls because everybody was either furloughed or working from home, so we couldn't actually do changes in the case. And that was 2020, and they're still up 5 years later. So not so temporary, but also been a really great teaching tool and really interesting to see people interact with it. I would say not everybody is a fan. That's fine, but it is kind of sparking conversation. So when I talked about hierarchy and creating and upholding false hierarchies, I used our fire making case, for example, and 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 that one was really interesting because we had just hosted a group of visitors, of Maasai visitors. You can see Samuel in the photo with us, and he pointed out saying, "Oh wait, this is a Maasai fire making stick." And then I was and kind of looked at it, and then he's like, "You have it the wrong way around." And that's partly because the label that was written, again, I said a lot of labels were written on the objects, was on the back side of it. So whoever had displayed it wanted to privilege I think it literally said, didn't have that much. It had the accession number, it said Maasai, and it said whoever donated it or collected it good to the museum. And that was it. So that actually goes into the second part of knowledge, what knowledge we're privileging. It's not about the knowledge of use, but it's the knowledge of who collected it. But more importantly, in that entire case, which is again all different kind of fire making sticks and drills, the word the way it was described, all those were only described for having to be of like use, so like for making, practical use for warmth or food. When it came to places that were basically non-European or not Eurocentric, but anywhere fire drills came that were like, for I think we have a couple that were from Denmark and Sweden. They were only talked about as being for ceremonial or ritual purposes, and that was it. So it's just really interesting that distinction and that was being created. But then when Yannick and Amos saw the fire drill, they also was like, "Oh, this is actually a really specific kind. This is only used for our this big celebration when everyone, no matter where you live, you come to you come back to kind of the home base and they light a fire in every hearth for the next political generation, next political cohort of the Maasai. And so, it was just really interesting because here in this case, they're talking about, fire drills for making fire only for practical purposes when it comes from people from kind of non-European areas. And then when they're talking about kind of more historic European fire drills, it's only for ritual purposes. But here are Yannick and Amos talking about this literally only for a ceremonial purpose. And so it was just very interesting how kind of breaking those hierarchies down. On the right side, you can see from our database, I pulled some words that we use, and I guess the database kind of holds all the information, about these objects historically. So even though current labels may not use these terms, it's still going to be saved on the database as part of the object's kind of interpretation history. And yeah, and so it was just really, really interesting because as you can see, the word modern, and again, this is all to do with fire making sticks and fire drills. So if the term modern was used in associated with that case, it was only for European objects. You can see where the term historically or savage was used, and whatnot. And so it was just really interesting, the kind of hierarchies that were still present within that database system. I think next we have, there we go. Knowledge, and I know we need to have time for questions, so I'm going to really breeze through the next two slides. And this one, to go back to the idea of what knowledge is privilege and what knowledge is privilege and who gets to produce knowledge. I often say in museums, and I think this goes across the board for many places, we use what I like to call kind of this kind of all-knowing God voice. Often you don't know who wrote the label, but we are still places of kind of authority. So it's just very interesting to think that it's this kind of idea that a museum label is this, sorry, non-biased kind of third person voice coming down, telling you, imparting knowledge. But again, you can see from this label in the center that starts opium is an illegal narcotic. This is from our opium case, or the whole part of this, the museum of this called smoking and stimulants, and this particular case has opium paraphernalia in it. And it's just really interesting because when you start breaking down that label, it's just fascinating, kind of all the things that start coming out. So it starts opium is an illegal narcotic. And it's just really interesting because obviously the term illegal is extremely value laden. We do know that like opium derivatives are also still used in medicines today, but also it doesn't say where opium is a legal narcotic. So it's this universal idea, which we do all the time in museum settings. It's not about specificity. And so it's just really interesting because the first time I read it, I was like, oh, I didn't know legality was universal, like so it was just really interesting. It says papaver, it refers to it as from the scientific name, which is fine because people have to learn. But I think it is also just really when someone sees that they're like, we have no idea what that is. Papaver somniferum. So you don't see it here, but on the intervention, we actually put a lot of other kind of colloquial names for opium used from like around the world, and it was just really interesting. People are like, oh yeah, I've heard that. That makes so much sense why it's called that. And so that again was just not privileging just kind of the scientific name alone. Most of the label talks about China, which again can go into so many stereotypes. But then you talk about China, but also they never, all the objects in that display basically collected during the Opium Wars, the first and second Opium Wars, but that is not talked about anywhere in the case or in the label. So it's just really interesting, kind of that, the idea that it's a British sanctioned opium trade, but it's not talked about. It does say that there was a thriving trade developed, so it's kind of referencing that later on in the 19th century. But it's also thriving for whom? Like, it was thriving for British colonial government as a source of revenue, but again, not said anywhere in the case at all. And so it's just very, again, nothing incorrect really a lot in that, but also lots of things missing. And so just again, it was just about how we construct knowledge in our spaces. And so, yeah, I really like using this case as an example of all the things that are unsaid, I would say. And think next one. Oh, so sorry, this is just this was the flip side of the intervention, that kind of showed you some colloquial names, but also gave you kind of the idea was looking at one plant, the poppy, but all the stories that we didn't tell, and the artists that I worked with kind of to respond to that in different ways. All right, so imposing a kind of specific culture onto another. I just realized I don't have a photo of the object this is talking about. It is referring to the labels on the Hawaiian feather cloak that we have in the museum. This beautiful ahu'ula is the correct Hawaiian term for it. Um, Made up of like hundreds of thousands of tiny honey creeper feathers. But anyway, I digress. I got really, really interested in this because every time, first of all, this case is like, I call it the interactive case. It's not really that interactive, but you have to, because of trying to protect the color of the feathers, we have a curtain over it. So visitors have to, they're like, oh, what's behind? They have to open the curtain and they have to press the button and the light will come on. And then after a minute, the light goes off automatically. So there are lots of people always stopping by trying to figure out what's going on here in this case. And every time I see young children and students with their teachers or their parents, they always look and they say, what is a, because you can see on one of the labels says Ke Kaulohi, Ke Kaulohi, sorry, the Lady Premier of King Kamehameha III. And the kids always ask, what's a lady premier? And inevitably, the adults always answer, oh, she was probably his first wife, which is not true. And it's just really interesting, like every single time. And so that kind of made me go into a deep dive into a lot of this. And what was just really fascinating throughout these two labels in the case was the way that gender worked in it. Basically, every single woman mentioned in this case is mentioned in relation to a man. Um, and so, as it says, it was given by Kei Kalohui, which, by the way, was also misspelled because it's missing all the diacritics. And Lahaina was also misspelled, as you can see here, because it's written exactly as it's written in the thing. The Lady Premier of Kamehameha III, first of all, she was what's called a Kuhina Nui. If we want to try to roughly translate, it would be like a prime minister. And she's not of Kamehameha III, but she'd have been the queen anyway of the people of the Hawaiian kingdom, the Lahui. And so it was just really interesting how they framed her here. And it said it was gifted to Sir George Simpson, head of the Hudson Bay Company, as a present to his wife. So again, his wife doesn't get a name. Her name is Frances Ramsey Simpson, but she doesn't get a name. She's just his wife. And like it's actually really, really key because in another label, which I don't have here, we talk about feather cloaks as being all about masculine power in the Hawaiian nation, which is not really true because by this time period, they're using them as diplomatic gifts as well. So as you can see by the gifting of this one. And so the fact that like it's a woman, Kei Kaului, gifting it to another woman, Frances Ramsey Simpson, is also really interesting and kind of shows you the change of the use of this object throughout time. But again, not said anywhere here and just kind of downplayed. And then when you go to the provenance part of it as well, all the women, Mrs. Ross Hayden, again, not her name, great granddaughter to Sir George Simpson, and Mrs. H.G. Beasley, again, wife of Mr. H.G. Beasley. This also makes it really difficult sometimes because it's when we don't have the women's names for provenance purposes, it's really hard to find out who they are. But yeah, so this whole case is just really interesting because it when it was written, it basically imposes certain kind of ideas of gender structures that also did not exist in Hawaii in the way that it's understood in this label. And so that's why I talk about kind of imposing one cultural structure over another. And I think that is where I'm going to end. But before I end, I just wanted to also show you when we use our online collections database, this is just a cultural advice warning we have. And and it says you can continue with or without warnings. And so this is just something we've also input because as I said, there's some objects that have specific warnings, mainly because maybe they may be secret or sacred, or just all there's just all these different things based on our conversations with the communities we work with, and or again, derogatory language might be part of the history, um, the display history, and that might be in the uh the catalog. So we just want people to know. And yeah, I think I'm going to stop sharing and have if anybody has any questions. Great.